With his ranch facing foreclosure and no money for veterinary bills, Richard Miller abandoned his injured horse at the edge of the forest, walking away as the bobcat's shadow slipped between the trees. What he didn't see was the wildlife biologist's camera capturing every moment of his desperate, shameful act, evidence that would soon shatter his carefully constructed life. The Montana sunrise painted the rolling hills of Clearwater County in shades of gold and amber, a cruel irony as Richard Miller surveyed his once thriving ranch with hollow eyes. At 65, the third-generation farmer had weathered many storms, but nothing had prepared him for the perfect disaster that now threatened to strip him of everything his family had built over nearly a century. 3 years, he muttered, his calloused hand gripping the porch railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. 3 years of drought, and now this. The this was a notice of foreclosure from Western Montana Bank, the final warning after months of missed payments and desperate negotiations. Behind him, the door creaked open, and his daughter Melissa stepped out, her face tense with worry. "Dad," the vet called. "He needs an answer about Thunder by noon." Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his prized American quarter horse. Thunder had been more than just livestock. He was the symbol of everything the Millers had achieved, a champion whose bloodline was worth its weight in gold, or at least it had been before the accident. "I told him I'd call back," Richard responded, his voice sharp enough to make Melissa flinch. "Dad, we can't just keep postponing. Thunder's in pain. Dr. Wilkins says the surgery—" "I know what Wilkins said," Richard snapped, turning to face his daughter. $20,000 for a procedure that might not even work. Another $5,000 in recovery care. Do you know what that kind of money could do for this ranch right now?" Melissa's eyes welled with tears. "So we're just going to let him suffer because of money? After everything Thunder's done for this family?" Richard looked past her to the barn, where his once magnificent stallion now lay, his shattered leg wrapped in bandages after a freak accident in the pasture 3 weeks earlier. Thunder had stepped in a prairie dog hole while running the fence line, a simple misstep that had twisted his life, and by extension, the Millers, into a nightmare. "And it's not just about money," Richard said, his voice softening slightly as he saw the pain in his daughter's eyes. "It's about making tough decisions. It's about survival." But even as he spoke the words, Richard knew they rang hollow. Thunder wasn't just an animal to them. When Richard's wife Sarah had died of cancer 5 years earlier, it was during his long rides on Thunder's back that he had finally found some measure of peace. The horse had been Sarah's final gift to him, purchased just months before her diagnosis. "Your mother would have wanted us to try," Melissa said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Richard turned away, unable to bear the truth in his daughter's words. "That your mother never had to watch everything she loved being taken away piece by piece." Later that morning, Richard drove his truck down to the western pasture, away from the prying eyes of his ranch hands and his daughter's silent judgment. The drought had turned what should have been lush grazing land into a dusty wasteland dotted with withered grass and sun-bleached rocks. He parked near the old oak that marked the boundary between his property and the national forest beyond. This far corner of the ranch was rarely visited these days. Too far from water, too sparse for grazing, perfect for what Richard had in mind. As he leaned against the truck's hood, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Dr. Wilkins again. Richard silenced it without looking at the screen. He'd made his decision, the only decision a businessman could make. Thunder was an asset, now a liability, and Richard Miller had not built his empire by carrying liabilities. What broke his heart wasn't just the financial burden of saving Thunder. It was the knowledge that even if he somehow found the money for the surgery, the bank would still take the ranch. Thunder would end up sold at auction to the highest bidder, probably one of those hobby farmers from California who wouldn't understand the horse's bloodline or history. Better a quick end than a life of uncertainty and possible neglect. At least that's what Richard told himself as he drove back to the barn, his mind made up about what needed to be done. He would tell Melissa they would euthanize Thunder humanely. That would be the story. But as he approached the barn, an entirely different plan began to form in his mind. A plan that would cost nothing, that would solve his immediate problem, and that would appear to be nothing more than the cruel hand of nature at work. Richard had seen the Bobcat tracks near the western boundary 3 times in the past month. Nature was harsh but efficient. And sometimes, Richard thought darkly, a man had to be the same way. That evening, after Melissa had gone into town for supplies, Richard approached his ranch foreman, Dale Jenkins. The 40-something cowboy had worked for the Millers since he was a teenager, his loyalty to the family as constant as the mountains that framed the horizon. "Need your help with Thunder," Richard said, his voice carefully neutral. "Think it's time we end his suffering." Dale removed his worn Stetson, turning it in his weathered hands. "Do Dr. Wilkins finally give the verdict?" Richard nodded, the lie coming easier than he expected. "Nothing to be done. I don't want Melissa here for it. Too hard on her." "Want me to call the vet to come out?" Dale asked, already reaching for his phone. "No," Richard said quickly. "No need to waste more money. I can handle it. Just need help getting him in the trailer." Dale's brow furrowed. "You taking him somewhere?" "There's a spot," Richard said vaguely, "by the old oak. Sarah and I used to ride there. Seems fitting." If Dale found the explanation strange, he didn't show it. The code of the West was clear. A man had the right to handle his business his way, especially when it came to putting down a beloved animal. An hour later, with Thunder sedated and loaded in the horse trailer, Richard drove slowly toward the western boundary. The setting sun cast long shadows across the drought-stricken land, as if nature itself was reaching out with dark fingers to claim what Richard was delivering. In the trailer behind him, Thunder shifted uneasily despite the sedative. The horse had always been intuitive, almost unnaturally aware of human emotions. Richard wondered if Thunder could sense what was coming. "It's business," Richard said aloud to the empty cab. Just business." But as he parked near the ancient oak and walked around to the trailer, his hands trembled. This wasn't like him. Richard Miller had always prided himself on doing things the right way, even when it was difficult. Sarah would have been ashamed. No, he corrected himself. Sarah never had to make these kinds of choices. She died before watching their world crumble piece by piece. With practiced movements, Richard lowered the trailer ramp and gently coaxed Thunder to back out. The powerful horse moved awkwardly, his injured leg held off the ground, eyes glazed from the medication. Richard led him to the oak tree, using a length of rope to secure him loosely to a low branch. "I'm sorry, old friend," he whispered, running a hand along Thunder's gleaming neck one last time. "The bank would take you anyway." At least this way. He couldn't finish the thought. What way was this? Abandoning an injured animal to be torn apart by predators. Even in his desperate state, Richard recognized the cruelty of his actions, but he'd come too far to turn back now. As Richard climbed back into his truck, he didn't notice the battered blue pickup that had pulled off the Forest Service road a quarter-mile away, or the figure watching through binoculars as he drove away. Jason Carter lowered his binoculars, his face hardening into a mask of disbelief. The 28-year-old wildlife biologist had been tracking the local bobcat population for his research with Montana State University when he'd spotted the unusual activity at the edge of Miller's property. "What the hell?" he muttered, reaching for his cell phone. As a researcher, Jason had developed a working relationship with many local ranchers, including the Millers. He'd met Richard several times and had occasionally helped Melissa with wildlife questions when their cattle encountered predators. But this, leaving an injured horse tied to a tree at dusk in known Bobcat territory, this was beyond comprehension. Jason dialed Melissa's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. The sun was sinking fast, painting the Montana sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple that would normally have captured his attention. Now, he barely noticed as he grabbed his gear and started hiking toward the oak tree. Back at the ranch house, Melissa returned from town to find Dale in the kitchen, making coffee. "Where's Dad?" she asked, setting down her grocery bags. "And why is Thunder's trailer gone?" Dale avoided her eyes, suddenly finding great interest in measuring coffee grounds. "Your father took Thunder out to the western pasture, said it was time." The color drained from Melissa's face. "Time? You mean he's putting Thunder down without even talking to me first?" "He said Dr. Wilkins confirmed there was nothing to be done," Dale explained, his voice gentle. "Said he wanted to spare you being there." "That's impossible," Melissa said, her voice rising. "Wilkins told me this morning that with surgery, Thunder had a 60% chance of recovery. Dad knows that." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her recent calls. "Look, Wilkins has been trying to reach Dad all day. He wanted to discuss a payment plan for the surgery." Dale set down the coffee pot slowly, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. "Melissa, your father said he was taking Thunder to the old oak near the forest boundary. Said it was a special place for him and your mother." "The western boundary?" Melissa's eyes widened in horror. "Dale, that's where we've been seeing those Bobcat tracks. Why would he take Thunder all the way out there just to—" The realization hit them both simultaneously. "Oh, God," Melissa whispered. "He wouldn't." But Dale was already grabbing his truck keys. "Call Wilkins and the sheriff. I'll head out there now." Dusk descended on the Montana wilderness like a heavy curtain, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. The temperature dropped rapidly as Jason Carter made his way through the underbrush toward the oak tree. His breath formed small clouds in the cooling air while his mind raced through possible scenarios, none of them good. In the gathering darkness, Thunder's white coat stood out like a beacon. The horse shifted nervously, his instincts fighting against the fading sedative. Even in his drugged state, Thunder seemed to sense the vulnerability of his position. His ears flicked back and forth, catching the subtle sounds of the forest that human ears couldn't detect. Jason approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and his voice low. "Easy, boy, easy there." Thunder's head jerked up, nostrils flaring. The horse tried to back away but was stopped short by the rope securing him to the tree. Pain flashed through his eyes as his injured leg touched the ground, causing him to nickering softly in distress. I know," Jason murmured, inching closer. "I'm going to help you, but you need to stay calm." As he reached the horse, Jason did a quick assessment of the situation. The rope was secured with a simple, quick-release knot. At least Miller had left that small mercy. But Thunder was too agitated to simply untie and lead away. Without proper equipment or assistance, moving an injured, frightened horse weighing over 1,000 pounds would be nearly impossible, especially in the growing darkness. Jason reached for his phone again, only to curse under his breath when he saw there was still no signal. He was on his own, at least for now. A twig snapped in the underbrush about 50 yards away, the sound unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. Thunder's reaction was immediate and violent. The horse reared as much as his injured leg would allow, pulling against the rope with panicked strength. "Whoa! Whoa!" Jason moved to Thunder's head, trying to calm him while scanning the tree line. His hand found the small canister of bear spray on his belt, a standard precaution for his field work. It might work on a bobcat if it came to that. In the dim light, Jason caught a flash of movement, a tawny shape slinking between trees at the edge of the clearing. The local bobcat, right on cue. The predator wasn't particularly large by bobcat standards, maybe 30 pounds. But it was muscular and efficient. Under normal circumstances, a bobcat would never attack an animal as large as a horse, but these weren't normal circumstances. Thunder was injured, unable to flee, and presenting all the signals of vulnerable prey. "Not today," Jason muttered, positioning himself between the horse and the approaching predator. Meanwhile, Richard Miller sat in his truck on the main road back to the ranch, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they'd gone numb. He'd pulled over when the reality of what he'd just done hit him with the force of a physical blow. Nausea rolled through his stomach, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty cab. In his mind's eye, he could see Sarah's face, the disappointment and horror in her eyes. This wasn't the man she had married, wasn't the father he'd raised Melissa to respect. For a moment, he considered turning around, going back for Thunder. He could tell Melissa he'd changed his mind about euthanizing the horse, that they would find the money for the surgery somehow, another lie to cover the first one. But before he could shift the truck into gear, his phone rang. Melissa's name flashed on the screen. Richard stared at it, unable to answer, unable to face his daughter's questions or accusations. After 4 rings, the call went to voicemail. Seconds later, a text message appeared. "Dad, I know about Thunder. Dale told me everything. How could you?" The simple message hit Richard like a physical blow, not just because he'd been caught, but because of the hurt and betrayal that radiated from those few words. Melissa, who had stood by him through everything, the drought, the financial struggles, the long, dark days after Sarah's death, now saw him for what he truly was. A coward who had abandoned a loyal animal to a cruel death rather than face his failures as a man and a provider. Richard's phone rang again. This time, it was the bank, probably calling about the foreclosure notice, asking when he'd be vacating the property. Richard silenced the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Then, with a sudden cry of anguish, he slammed his palm against the steering wheel. "Damn it all!" he shouted into the empty truck. "Damn it all to hell!" Tears blurred his vision as he finally shifted the truck into drive, but instead of continuing toward the ranch, he made a U-turn. Whatever happened next, he couldn't leave Thunder to die alone in the darkness. He'd face the consequences of his actions, face his daughter's judgment and the community's scorn if necessary, but he would not compound his mistake with cowardice. Back at the oak tree, the standoff between Jason and the bobcat continued. The predator circled warily, instinct warring with hunger. Thunder's agitation had only increased, the horse pulling against his restraint with enough force that Jason worried he might further injure his damaged leg. The sound of an approaching vehicle caught Jason's attention. Headlights cut through the twilight as a truck bounced along the rough access road toward them. The bobcat melted back into the forest at this new disturbance, but Jason knew it wouldn't go far. Predators could be patient when motivated by hunger. As the truck skidded to a stop, Jason recognized Dale Jenkins behind the wheel. The ranch foreman jumped out, followed closely by Melissa Miller. "Thunder!" Melissa cried, rushing toward the distressed horse. "Oh God, what did he do to you?" "Careful," Jason warned, stepping forward to intercept her. "He's scared and in pain, and we've got company." He nodded toward the tree line where the bobcat had disappeared. Dale assessed the situation quickly, his experienced eyes taking in Thunder's condition and the surrounding terrain. "We need to get him loaded up now. That cat's not the only predator out here after dark. Cougars move through this area too. He's too agitated to move easily," Jason explained. "And with that leg, I brought a sedative," Melissa interrupted, holding up a small case. "Dr. Wilkins gave it to me when I called him." Said it would be enough to calm Thunder without knocking him completely out. As Melissa prepared the injection, another set of headlights appeared on the horizon, approaching fast. "That'll be the sheriff," Dale said, but his expression changed as the vehicle came closer. "No, that's Richard's truck." Melissa's head snapped up, her face hardening. "Let him come," she said, her voice cold with fury. "Let him see what he's done." Richard's truck skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust, the headlights illuminating the tableau before him. His daughter and foreman huddled around Thunder, with a stranger standing guard. For a moment, Richard remained frozen behind the wheel, shame rooting him in place. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out to face the consequences of his actions. "Dad." Melissa's voice cut through the evening air, sharp as a blade. She stood protectively beside Thunder, the syringe of sedative still in her hand. The disappointment in her eyes hurt worse than any anger could have. "I came back," Richard said weakly, taking a hesitant step forward. "I couldn't go through with it." "But you did go through with it," Jason interjected, stepping into the light. "You left an injured animal tied to a tree in predator territory at dusk. What exactly did you think would happen here, Mr. Miller?" Richard recognized the young man now, the wildlife researcher who occasionally consulted with local ranchers. The judgment in the younger man's eyes mirrored what Richard already felt in his heart. "I wasn't thinking straight," Richard admitted, his voice hollow. "The bank, the drought, Thunder's medical bills, I just—" "Save it," Dale cut in, uncharacteristically harsh toward his longtime employer. "Whatever was going through your head, we've got more pressing matters now. There's at least one Bobcat circling, possibly more predators on the way, and we need to get Thunder loaded before full dark." As if to emphasize Dale's point, a distant yowl echoed from the tree line. Not the Bobcat they'd seen earlier, but something else. Something larger. "Mountain lion," Jason confirmed, his experienced ear identifying the sound instantly. "And it sounds hungry." The group's urgency increased tenfold. Melissa quickly administered the sedative to Thunder, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Richard stood awkwardly to the side, wanting to help but unsure if his assistance would be welcome. "Make yourself useful," Dale finally said to Richard, tossing him a flashlight from the truck. "Keep watch on the tree line. Anything moves, you sing out." Grateful for the direction, Richard positioned himself where he could scan the forest edge, the powerful beam cutting through the gathering darkness. Behind him, he could hear the others working to calm Thunder and prepare him for transport. "The sedative's working," Melissa reported after a few minutes, his breathing steadier. "Good," Jason replied. But we still need to get that rope off and guide him to the trailer. With that leg, it won't be easy." Richard listened to their hushed conversation, the professional competence in their voices making his own actions seem even more shameful by comparison. These were people who solved problems, who faced challenges head-on, while he had chosen the coward's way out. A movement at the edge of the forest caught Richard's attention. He swung the flashlight toward it, catching a glimpse of tawny fur slinking between trees. "We've got company," he called, his voice tense. 10 o'clock, about 40 yards out. Jason moved to Richard's side, peering into the darkness. "I see it. Too big for our Bobcat friend. That's the mountain lion." The cougar was indeed massive, a male weighing at least 150 pounds, with powerful shoulders and deadly intent in its amber eyes. Unlike the Bobcat, which had shown caution, this predator exuded confidence. It paused at the edge of the light, unperturbed by the human presence, its gaze fixed on Thunder. "It's not backing down," Jason murmured, reaching for his bear spray. "This one's hungry enough to consider us part of the meal." Dale joined them, carrying his rifle from the truck. "I won't shoot unless absolutely necessary," he said. But I'm not losing anyone tonight, human or horse." Behind them, Melissa was making progress with Thunder. The sedative had taken effect, calming the horse enough that she'd been able to remove the rope from the tree. Now she stood at his head, whispering soothingly, while keeping tension on the lead rope. "Easy, Thunder. You're going to be okay," she murmured, her voice carrying a confidence she didn't entirely feel. We're going to get you home." The mountain lion took a step forward, testing their resolve. "Hold your ground," Jason advised the others. "Don't run. Don't turn your back." Richard felt a primal fear course through him, but also something else. A fierce protectiveness that overshadowed his shame. This was his family, his responsibility. He had created this dangerous situation, and now he needed to help resolve it. "But what's the plan?" he asked, his voice steadier than he expected. "We need to get Thunder to the trailer without spooking him or triggering the cat's hunting instinct," Jason explained. "Slow, deliberate movements. I'll keep the cat's attention while you three work with Thunder." "No," Richard countered, surprising himself with his decisiveness. "I'll distract the cat." It got us into this mess. Before anyone could argue, Richard began moving laterally, away from the group, keeping his flashlight trained on the predator. The mountain lion's head swiveled to follow him, momentarily diverted from Thunder. "Now," Richard called, "get him moving while the cat's focused on me." Dale nodded tersely, hurrying back to help Melissa with Thunder. Jason hesitated, torn between assisting with the horse and keeping an eye on Richard's dangerous gambit. "Go!" Richard insisted. "I've got this." As Jason reluctantly joined Dale and Melissa, Richard continued his slow movement, maintaining eye contact with the predator. The mountain lion watched him with unnerving intensity, its tail twitching in contemplation. Every instinct in Richard's body screamed at him to run, but he held his ground, remembering Jason's warning. Behind him, he could hear the others coaxing Thunder toward the trailer, the horse's labored breathing and occasional snort marking their slow progress. Richard didn't dare look back, keeping his attention fixed on the immediate threat. "Almost there," Dale called out. "Just a few more steps." The mountain lion chose that moment to advance, taking 3 quick strides toward Richard, heart hammering in his chest. Richard made himself appear larger, raising his arms and shouting, "Hey, back off!" To his amazement, the predator hesitated, clearly weighing the risk versus reward of the situation. In that moment of indecision, a new sound cut through the night, the mechanical whine of an approaching ATV. The mountain lion's ears flattened at this unfamiliar threat, and after one last, longing look at the potential meal slipping away, it melted back into the forest. Richard released a shuddering breath, his legs suddenly weak with relief. He turned to see Thunder being carefully guided up the trailer ramp by Dale and Melissa, while Jason scanned the tree line for further threats. The ATV burst into the clearing, its headlight illuminating Sheriff Mike Donovan's stern face. The local lawman took in the scene with a practiced eye, his expression growing increasingly bewildered. "Someone want to tell me what in tarnation is going on out here?" he demanded, cutting the engine. "I got a panicked call about an injured horse, possible animal cruelty, and predators." 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Richard, waiting for his response. The moment of truth had arrived. The silence stretched taut as a wire between them all, broken only by Thunder's labored breathing from inside the trailer. Richard Miller stood at the center of a circle of accusatory gazes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. For a man who had spent his life commanding respect in the community, the sensation of shame was both foreign and overwhelming. "I did it," Richard finally said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I brought Thunder out here and left him tied to that tree." Sheriff Donovan's weathered face remained impassive as he dismounted from his ATV. At 58, Mike Donovan had served Clearwater County for over 2 decades, handling everything from bar fights to missing hikers. Very little surprised him anymore, but the confession from one of the county's most respected ranchers clearly caught him off guard. "You want to run that by me again, Rich?" the sheriff asked, as if he might have misheard. "You heard me, Mike," Richard replied, meeting the lawman's eyes directly. "I brought my injured horse out here to be killed by predators because I couldn't afford his medical care and didn't want to pay for euthanasia." Melissa flinched at her father's blunt words, while Dale looked away uncomfortably. Only Jason maintained steady eye contact with Richard, a glimmer of reluctant respect showing in his expression at the older man's straightforward confession. Sheriff Donovan removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "That's animal cruelty, Rich. You know that. State law is clear." "I know. Had to come back though, didn't you?" the sheriff observed, his keen eyes noting the sequence of events from the multiple vehicles present. "Otherwise, you wouldn't be here now." "I came back," Richard acknowledged, "but not soon enough." If Jason hadn't spotted what was happening, he trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The sheriff turned to Jason. "You're the wildlife fella from the university, right? Want to give me your version?" Jason described discovering Thunder tied to the tree, the approaching Bobcat, and his attempts to protect the horse until help arrived. Throughout his account, he remained professional, stating facts without embellishment or accusation. When he finished, Sheriff Donovan nodded thoughtfully. "Melissa?" the sheriff turned to Richard's daughter. "You have anything to add?" Melissa stood straighter, her face pale but composed in the truck's headlights. "Only that we need to get Thunder to Dr. Wilkins right away. Whatever happens with my father is secondary to saving our horse." Richard felt her words like a physical blow. Secondary. That's what he had become in his daughter's eyes, an afterthought to the well-being of the animal he had betrayed. The sheriff seemed to sense the tension. "We can continue this discussion at the clinic. Rich, you'll ride with me. The rest of you get that horse to Wilkins." As Richard moved toward the sheriff's ATV, Melissa finally met his eyes. The hurt and disappointment he saw there was worse than any legal punishment awaiting him. "Why, Dad?" she asked simply. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" Richard opened his mouth to explain about the foreclosure notice, about his pride, about the impossible choices he'd faced, but no words came. In that moment, every justification felt hollow, every explanation inadequate. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I just broke." Something shifted in Melissa's expression. Not forgiveness, certainly, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of betrayal that had risen between them. With a brief nod, she turned away and climbed into Dale's truck. The drive to town was mercifully quiet, with Sheriff Donovan respecting Richard's silence as they followed the trucks carrying Thunder and the others. The familiar landscape of Clearwater County slipped by in darkness, farms and ranches marked only by distant porch lights like earthbound stars. "You know," the sheriff finally said as they approached the outskirts of town, "in 30 years of law enforcement, I've never known a good man who didn't make at least one terrible mistake." Richard stared straight ahead. "Is that supposed to make me feel better, Mike?" "No," the sheriff replied simply. "Just an observation." They arrived at Clearwater Veterinary Clinic to find Dr. Wilkins already waiting, alerted by Melissa's call. The middle-aged veterinarian directed Dale and Jason as they carefully unloaded Thunder from the trailer and guided him into the large animal treatment area. Richard watched helplessly from the parking lot, knowing his presence would only distress Thunder and Melissa further. Instead, he turned to the sheriff, ready to face whatever came next. "So what happens now?" he asked. "You arresting me?" Sheriff Donovan considered Richard thoughtfully. You familiar with Judge Reynolds' approach to cases like this? Richard nodded slowly. Martha Reynolds was known for her creative sentencing, particularly in cases where traditional punishment seemed less effective than rehabilitation. She's likely to take your clean record into account, the sheriff continued, and the fact that you came back of your own volition. But she doesn't look kindly on animal cruelty, Rich. You know that. I'm not asking for leniency, Richard said. Good, because you're not likely to get it. The sheriff gestured toward the clinic entrance. Let's go see how that horse of yours is doing before we head to the station. Inside, the clinic buzzed with activity. Dr. Wilkins was examining Thunder's injured leg, while Melissa and a veterinary technician held the horse steady. Jason stood nearby, answering questions about Thunder's condition during the rescue. Richard paused in the doorway, suddenly uncertain of his place in this scenario. He was no longer the decision-maker, the patriarch whose word was law. He was the transgressor, present only on sufferance. Dr. Wilkins looked up, noticing Richard's hesitant stance. With a professional nod, he said, Mr. Miller, I was just explaining to your daughter that Thunder's condition hasn't significantly worsened despite this evening's events. The careful neutrality in the veterinarian's tone spoke volumes about his personal feelings on the matter. The surgery is still an option, Richard asked. Yes, though the chances of full recovery have decreased somewhat. We'd need to operate tomorrow at the latest. Richard nodded, then asked the question weighing heaviest on his mind. And the cost? Before Dr. Wilkins could answer, Jason Carter stepped forward. I've been in touch with my department at the university. Given Thunder's bloodline and the research value of documenting his recovery, we might be able to cover part of the procedure as a case study. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and undeserved. Richard blinked in surprise, while Melissa looked at Jason with newfound appreciation. That's very generous, Richard managed. It's not charity, Jason clarified, his tone professional. It's genuine research interest. Quarter horse leg injuries are understudied compared to thoroughbreds, and Thunder's case could provide valuable data. Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat. Well, that's a stroke of luck. Now, about the legal matters. Wait, Melissa interrupted, stepping forward. Before anything else happens, I need a moment alone with my father. The others exchanged glances, then filed out of the treatment area, leaving father and daughter facing each other across Thunder's sedated form. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Melissa broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. You were going to let him die. After everything he meant to Mom. After everything he's meant to us. The words hung between them, the simple truth more damning than any elaborate accusation could have been. Richard felt the weight of his daughter's words like stones piling on his chest. In the sterile light of the veterinary clinic, with Thunder's massive form between them, there was nowhere to hide from the truth. I don't expect you to understand, he finally said, his voice hoarse. Then help me understand, Melissa countered, because the father I know, the father Mom loved, would never have done something so cruel. Richard's shoulders sagged as the facade he'd maintained for months finally crumbled. The bank is foreclosing on the ranch. I received the final notice yesterday. We have 30 days to vacate. Melissa's eyes widened. What? But you said the restructuring was working, that we'd turned a corner. I lied, Richard interrupted, the admission like bile in his throat. I've been lying for months. The drought killed us. Mel, 3 years of failed crops, having to sell off half the herd at rock-bottom prices. We're not just struggling. We're done. But why keep it from me? I'm not a child, Dad. I'm your partner in the ranch. Because I failed. The words exploded from him with unexpected force. Your mother trusted me to preserve her family's legacy, and I failed. You trusted me to manage things after she died, and I failed. Every morning I wake up knowing that I'm going to lose everything Sarah and I built together, everything that was supposed to be your inheritance. Melissa stared at her father, seeing for the first time the depth of desperation that had been hiding behind his stoic facade. The proud man who had taught her to ride, who had never shown weakness even at her mother's funeral, now stood before her, broken and diminished. "So thunder was what, the last straw?" she asked. Gentler now, but still probing the wound. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the injured horse. $25,000 for a horse that might never fully recover, when I can't even keep a roof over our heads. It seemed impossible. But to do what you did. "I'm not defending it," Richard cut in. "There's no defense. I broke Mel. Everything I am, a provider, a caretaker, a father, none of it means anything if I can't even keep the ranch going." Melissa was quiet for a long moment, processing her father's words. Finally, she said, "You're wrong. Being a father isn't about success. It's about integrity. It's about teaching me what's right by doing what's right, even when it's hard." Her words struck him like a physical blow, echoing what Sarah would have said. "And your mother would be so disappointed in me," he whispered. "Yes," Melissa agreed, not softening the truth. "She would be, but she would also expect you to make it right." Before Richard could respond, Dr. Wilkins returned, accompanied by Jason and the sheriff. "Sorry to interrupt," the veterinarian said, "but I need to make a decision about Thunder's surgery. If we're proceeding, I need to prep him now and operate first thing in the morning." Melissa looked to her father, waiting for his response. In that moment, Richard understood that while she was giving him a chance to make the right choice, she would never again blindly trust his decisions. "Do the surgery," Richard said firmly. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, Thunder deserves that chance." Dr. Wilkins nodded. "I'll need a deposit. I can provide that," Jason interjected, stepping forward. "The university grant can be processed immediately for cases like this." The veterinarian looked between them, then nodded. "All right then, I'll start prepping now." As Dr. Wilkins moved away to prepare for the procedure, Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat. "Rich, I still need to take you in to process the charges. Judge Reynolds will see you for arraignment in the morning." "I understand," Richard replied, resigned to the legal consequences of his actions. "Dad, I'll stay here with Thunder," Melissa said, "and then I'll call Uncle Robert about the foreclosure. Maybe he can help." Richard shook his head. "Your mother's brother hasn't spoken to me since the funeral. He blames me for her working so hard during her illness." "Well, I'm calling him anyway," Melissa insisted. "This isn't just about you anymore." As Richard prepared to leave with the sheriff, Jason approached him with unexpected directness. "Mr. Miller, I know this isn't the time, but there's something you should know. The university has been looking to acquire land for a new wildlife research station. Specifically, land that borders the national forest." Richard frowned, not following. "What does that have to do with me?" "Your western pasture, the one where you took Thunder. It's ideal for our purposes. The department has funding allocated for land acquisition. It wouldn't save the entire ranch, but it might buy you enough time to restructure the rest of your debt." Hope flickered briefly in Richard's eyes before doubt extinguished it. "Odum, why would you help me after what I did?" Jason's expression remained professionally neutral. "It's not about helping you. It's about the land, the research opportunities, and—" He glanced at Melissa, then quickly away, "and preserving a part of Clearwater County's agricultural heritage." Sheriff Donovan, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "That's something to consider, Rich. But for now, we need to go." As Richard followed the sheriff out, he passed Dale, who had been waiting silently in the hallway. The foreman's expression was unreadable, decades of loyalty warring with fresh disappointment. "Dale," Richard acknowledged, uncertain what else to say. The foreman nodded once. "I'll look after things at the ranch. And I'll make sure Melissa gets home safely." It was a small courtesy, but in that moment, it meant everything. Even after his terrible lapse in judgment, the connections that defined Richard's life, the people who had stood by him through drought and hardship and grief, remained intact, if badly strained. As he stepped into the cool night air, guided by Sheriff Donovan's firm hand on his shoulder, Richard felt something unexpected beneath his shame and regret. The faint stirring of hope. Not for himself. He deserved whatever punishment came his way, but for Thunder, for Melissa, and for the legacy that might yet be salvaged from his moment of weakness. Behind him, through the clinic window, he glimpsed Melissa deep in conversation with Jason, their heads bent together over what appeared to be maps of the Miller property. The future was taking shape without him, and for the first time in years, Richard found that he didn't need to control it. The Clearwater County Courthouse stood like a sentinel in the morning light, its red brick facade and white columns a testament to small-town permanence amid changing times. Richard sat alone on a bench in the hallway, outside Courtroom B. Dressed in the same clothes he'd worn the previous day, now rumpled from a night in the county jail, he'd refused Melissa's offer to bring him a fresh shirt, feeling somehow that he deserved this small discomfort. Inside the courtroom, Judge Martha Reynolds was finishing up a minor traffic case. At 65, the judge was a Clearwater County institution, fair but uncompromising, with a reputation for creative sentencing that addressed the root causes of crimes rather than simply punishing them. "All rise." The bailiff's voice pulled Richard from his thoughts. As he entered the courtroom, he was surprised to see nearly a dozen familiar faces in the gallery. Dale sat stoically in the back row. Dr. Wilkins had taken time away from his clinic. Sheriff Donovan stood by the door in his official capacity, and in the front row, Melissa sat beside Jason Carter, their shoulders nearly touching. The sight of his daughter next to the wildlife biologist stirred complex emotions in Richard. There was something in their body language, a natural ease that spoke of more than just their shared concern for Thunder. Had there been something between them before this incident, or was this new connection forged in the crucible of crisis? "Richard James Miller," Judge Reynolds began, peering at him over her reading glasses. "You're charged with animal cruelty, a Class A misdemeanor in Montana. How do you plead?" Richard stood straighter. "Guilty, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the small gallery. Judge Reynolds studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller, I've known you for 30 years. You've sat on community boards, donated to local charities, and by all accounts, run an ethical ranching operation. This behavior seems entirely out of character. Would you care to explain yourself before I pass sentence?" Richard had prepared a speech during his sleepless night in the cell, explanations about financial pressure, about the impossible choices drought had forced upon him. But standing before the judge, with Melissa watching, those prepared words evaporated. "There's no explanation that would justify what I did, Your Honor," he said simply. "I made a terrible decision that betrayed everything I claim to stand for. I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate." Judge Reynolds removed her glasses, considering him thoughtfully. "Well, that's refreshingly straightforward, but before I sentence you, I'd like to hear from some others." She glanced at her docket. "Dr. Wilkins, you've provided a statement about the horse's condition." The veterinarian stood. Yes, Your Honor. Thunder underwent surgery this morning to repair his fractured leg. The procedure went well, though recovery will be lengthy. Without intervention, he would have certainly died from predator attack or exposure. And the prognosis. With proper care and rehabilitation, he has approximately a 60% chance of returning to limited use. Not for competition or heavy work, but a comfortable life. That's actually better than I initially estimated. The judge nodded. Thank you, Doctor. I'd also like to hear from Jason Carter. Jason Rose, professional and composed. Your Honor, as a wildlife biologist who witnessed part of yesterday's events, I can confirm that Mr. Miller's actions placed the horse in imminent danger. However, I also observed his return to the scene and his efforts to protect Thunder from predators, putting himself at considerable risk. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. You're offering a mitigating perspective, Mr. Carter. I believe in noting all relevant facts, Your Honor. Mr. Miller's initial action was reprehensible, but his subsequent attempt to rectify it speaks to his character. I see. The judge turned her attention to Melissa. Ms. Miller, would you like to address the court about your father's actions? Melissa stood, her expression a complex mixture of hurt, loyalty, and determination. My father made a terrible mistake, Your Honor. One that shocked and disappointed me deeply, but he's also the man who taught me that when you make a mistake, you own it and make it right. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Yesterday, I learned that our ranch is being foreclosed on. My father kept that from me, trying to shoulder the burden alone. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps me understand it. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom at this revelation. In small agricultural communities like Clearwater County, a ranch foreclosure wasn't just a private financial matter. It was a blow to the community's fabric, a sign of the changing times that threatened a shared way of life. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. Thank you for your candor, Ms. Miller. Now, regarding sentencing. The courtroom fell silent as the judge considered the case before her. Richard stood perfectly still, accepting whatever was to come. Richard Miller, I find your actions disturbing and contrary to the values of this community. However, I also recognize a man who has reached his breaking point under extraordinary pressure. She straightened her papers decisively. I hereby sentence you to the following. First, 1 year of probation. Second, 500 hours of community service to be served specifically at the Clearwater County Animal Shelter. Third, completion of an animal ethics course at Montana State University. She fixed Richard with a stern gaze. Additionally, you will be required to participate in the Montana Rancher Mental Health Program, which provides counseling and support for agricultural producers facing financial and emotional hardship. Richard blinked in surprise at this last requirement. The program was relatively new, created in response to the alarmingly high rates of depression and suicide among ranchers and farmers facing climate challenges and changing economics. Do you understand and accept these terms, Mr. Miller? Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Judge Reynolds cautioned. This isn't leniency. This is an opportunity to make amends and address the underlying issues that led to this incident. If you violate any terms of your probation or fail to complete the required programs, you will serve jail time. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Your Honor. As the judge closed the case and moved on to other matters, Richard turned to find Melissa waiting for him. The courtroom began to empty, people filing out with subdued conversations and occasional glances in his direction. That went better than expected, Melissa said quietly. Richard nodded. Better than I deserved. Judge Reynolds has always been good at seeing the bigger picture. She hesitated, then added, I'm heading back to the clinic to check on Thunder, Dr. Wilkins says the next 48 hours are critical. "I'd like to come," Richard said, then quickly added, "But I understand if you'd rather I didn't." Before Melissa could respond, Jason approached them, his expression professional, but with a warmth in his eyes when he looked at Melissa that Richard couldn't miss. "Mr. Miller," Jason acknowledged with a nod. "I've been in further discussions with my department chair about the land acquisition, and they're interested in expediting the process given your situation." "I appreciate that," Richard replied, genuinely grateful despite the awkwardness between them. "And thank you for what you said to the judge." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I just stated the facts as I observed them." "Well, regardless, thank you." An uncomfortable silence fell among the three of them, broken when Dale approached from the back of the courtroom. "A truck's outside whenever you're ready," the foreman said to Melissa. "And Rich, if you're headed back to the ranch, I can give you a ride." Richard looked to his daughter, waiting for her decision about the clinic visit. Melissa sighed. "Dad, of course you should come see Thunder. He's still your horse. And whatever happened yesterday, you're still my father." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall that had risen between them. Richard felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Outside the courthouse, the late morning sun illuminated Clearwater County with unforgiving clarity. Main Street businesses were open for the day, and Richard felt the weight of community eyes following him as he walked with Melissa toward Dale's truck. News traveled fast in small towns. By now, everyone would know what he'd done and what it said about the Miller Ranch's financial situation. There would be gossip, judgment, and perhaps worst of all, pity. As if reading his thoughts, Melissa said quietly, "We'll get through this, Dad." The ranch, Thunder, all of it, one step at a time. For the first time since the foreclosure notice had arrived, Richard allowed himself to believe that might be true. Thunder's recovery stall at Clearwater Veterinary Clinic had been transformed into something resembling a war room. Melissa had taped up a detailed care schedule on one wall, while Dr. Wilkins' treatment notes occupied another. A padded sling helped support the horse's weight, taking pressure off his surgically repaired leg. IV lines delivered antibiotics and pain medication, their soft dripping a constant companion to Thunder's occasional nickering. Richard paused in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. It had been 3 days since the surgery, 3 days since his court appearance. He'd given Melissa space, focusing instead on his first meetings with his probation officer and the initial assessment for the mental health program. Now, watching his daughter gently stroke Thunder's neck while checking his vitals, Richard felt like an intruder in a world that had continued turning without him. "You can come in," Melissa said without turning around. "He's having a good morning." Richard stepped hesitantly into the stall. Thunder's ears flicked in his direction, the horse's dark eyes tracking his movement with what Richard imagined was accusation, or perhaps that was just his own guilt projecting. "Dr. Wilkins says the incision site is looking clean," Melissa continued, maintaining a professional tone. "No signs of infection." Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. He reached a tentative hand toward Thunder, then pulled back, afraid of the horse's reaction. He won't bite," Melissa said, softer now. "He's not like people. He doesn't hold grudges." Richard tried again, gently placing his palm against Thunder's muscular shoulder. The horse remained still, neither welcoming nor rejecting the touch. "I'm sorry, old friend," Richard whispered, the words inadequate but necessary. "I failed you." Thunder shifted slightly, leaning his weight almost imperceptibly toward Richard's hand. It wasn't forgiveness. Animals didn't think in such human terms, but it was acceptance, and that was enough for now. "The university deposit cleared," Melissa said, changing the subject as she checked Thunder's IV line. Jason's department put down 5,000 toward the surgery costs, with another 5 coming when they publish their case study. That's generous of them, Richard responded carefully, aware of the complicated dynamics at play. Dane, speaking of Jason, how are things progressing with the land proposal? A slight flush colored Melissa's cheeks at the mention of the biologist, not escaping Richard's notice. He's meeting with the full department committee today. If they approve the proposal, they could make a formal offer by the end of the week. For the western section only, about 200 acres, including the area bordering the national forest. She finally met his eyes directly. It would be enough to pay off the most pressing debts and maybe restructure the mortgage on the remaining property. Richard absorbed this information, hope and loss tangling in his chest. Selling off part of the ranch felt like admitting defeat, yet it also represented a path forward, a compromise that might save the heart of what the Millers had built. "And what does Dale think?" Richard asked, knowing his foreman's opinion carried weight with Melissa. "He thinks it's our best option." She hesitated, then added, "Uncle Robert called back. He's not interested in helping." Richard nodded, unsurprised by his brother-in-law's response. "Robert made his feelings clear at your mother's funeral. The Miller Ranch was never his concern." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, broken only by Thunder's soft breathing and the distant sounds of the clinic's daily operations. "I start at the animal shelter tomorrow," Richard finally said. "At first shift of my community service." Melissa's expression softened slightly. "Cindy Larson still runs the place, doesn't she? Mom used to volunteer there." "Yes." She sounded reserved when I called to arrange the schedule. "People will come around, Dad." Melissa checked her watch. "I need to get back to the ranch. Dale and I are meeting with the bank representative this afternoon. They've agreed to postpone any action until we see if the university deal goes through." Richard wanted to protest, to insist that he should be at that meeting. It was his ranch and his responsibility, but he swallowed the words. He had forfeited the right to lead when he'd chosen deception over honesty. "I trust your judgment," he said instead, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Melissa paused at the stall door. "Jason mentioned that the mental health program started yesterday. How was it?" Richard considered deflecting the question, falling back on his lifelong habit of handling difficult things alone. But that approach had led him here, to this moment of fractured trust and conditional redemption. "Uncomfortable," he admitted. "No, talking about feelings isn't exactly my strong suit, Dad," Melissa said with the ghost of a smile. "That might be the understatement of the century." It wasn't much, but that small flash of their old rapport felt like water in the desert. The following morning found Richard pulling into the gravel parking lot of the Clearwater County Animal Shelter, a modest single-story building on the outskirts of town. The facility housed stray and surrendered animals from across the county, operating on a shoestring budget and the dedication of volunteers. Richard sat in his truck for several minutes, gathering his courage. His court appearance had been one thing, a formal proceeding with clear rules and expectations. This was different. This was facing people who had known him his entire life, now as someone who had committed an act they would find difficult to understand or forgive. Finally, with a deep breath, he stepped out into the cool morning air and approached the entrance. Cindy Larson met him at the front desk, her expression carefully neutral. At 57, she had the weathered look of someone who had spent decades fighting uphill battles for causes she believed in. She had been Sarah's friend, part of the same church group, and had attended dozens of Miller family barbecues over the years. "Richard," she acknowledged with a nod. "Judge Reynolds called to confirm your hours. 500 day to be completed within 12 months. Yes, ma'am, Richard replied, feeling oddly like a schoolboy being reprimanded. Cindy studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Sarah would have been heartbroken by what you did, Richard. The simple truth of her words hit harder than any elaborate condemnation could have. I know, he said quietly. But, Cindy continued, her tone softening slightly, she would have also believed in second chances. So that's what you're getting here, a second chance to remember who you really are. She handed him a schedule and a worn shelter vest. And we're short-staffed and over capacity, as usual. You'll start with the basics, cleaning kennels, feeding, walking dogs. Once you've proven yourself reliable, we can talk about more responsibility. Richard accepted the vest, noticing the irony of his situation. He, who had commanded respect as one of the county's most successful ranchers, would now be scrubbing dog kennels under supervision. Thank you for the opportunity, he said, meaning it despite the humbling circumstances. Cindy led him through the facility, explaining protocols and introducing him to the two other staff members working that morning. Both were polite but reserved, clearly aware of why he was there. The work was physically demanding in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. Bending to clean kennels aggravated his bad knee, and the constant lifting of food bags and water buckets strained his back. But there was something cleansing about the simple, direct nature of the labor. The animals didn't care about his shame or his regrets. They responded only to his immediate actions, his gentleness or roughness, his patience or frustration. By midday, Richard had settled into a rhythm, finding unexpected peace in the methodical tasks. He was hosing down the outdoor runs when a familiar truck pulled into the parking lot. Jason Carter stepped out, carrying a cardboard box that mewed plaintively. Mr. Miller, Jason greeted him with surprise. I didn't realize you'd be here today. First day, Richard explained, gesturing to his vest. Community service. Jason nodded. Right. That makes sense. He lifted the box slightly. Found these kittens abandoned near my research site. Too young to survive on their own. Cindy's in the office, Richard directed, then hesitated before adding, how did the committee meeting go? About the land? Jason's expression brightened. Actually, that's partly why I stopped by. I was hoping to catch Melissa here. The committee approved the proposal unanimously. We're prepared to make a formal offer. Relief washed over Richard. Oh, that's good news. Melissa is at the ranch, meeting with the bank. I know, I tried calling, but reception out there is spotty. Jason shifted awkwardly, the box of kittens mewing more insistently. Look, Mr. Miller, I should get these little ones inside, but there's something I wanted to say. Richard braced himself, uncertain what was coming. What happened with Thunder was wrong, Jason said directly. But I've spent enough time around farmers and ranchers to know that desperate circumstances can drive good people to make terrible choices. The measure of a person isn't that they never fail, but how they respond when they do. The young biologist's unexpected grace left Richard momentarily speechless. I appreciate that perspective, he finally managed. Especially considering your relationship with my daughter. Jason's eyes widened slightly. Sir, Melissa and I have only recently... It's all right, Richard interrupted. I've seen the way you look at her, and more importantly, I've seen how she looks at you. Sarah used to look at me that way once upon a time. Before Jason could respond, the kittens made their hunger known with increased volume. You should get them inside, Richard said. And Jason, thank you. Not just for the land offer, but for being there for Melissa when I wasn't. As Jason nodded and continued toward the shelter entrance, Richard turned back to his work, a complex mixture of emotions washing through him. Loss and hope, regret and possibility, all intertwined like the braided streams of the river that ran through Miller Land. For the first time since Thunder's accident, since the foreclosure notice, since the moment of weakness that had nearly cost him everything, Richard felt something shift within him. Not healing, not yet, but the first tentative steps toward whatever came next. 6 weeks passed in a blur of small victories and quiet reconciliations. The Montana autumn painted the landscape in gold and amber as Thunder took his first tentative steps without the support sling. Richard watched from outside the rehabilitation paddock, where Dr. Wilkins and Melissa carefully guided the horse in a slow, halting circuit. "That's it, big guy," Melissa encouraged, her hand steady on Thunder's bridle, one step at a time. The horse moved cautiously, his surgically repaired leg bearing weight for increasingly longer periods. Though he would never again race along fence lines or carry a rider at full gallop, the simple fact of his standing, walking, surviving felt like a miracle. "His progress is remarkable," Jason said, joining Richard at the fence. The two men had developed a cautious rapport over the weeks, their shared concern for Thunder and Melissa creating an unexpected bridge between them. "He's always been stubborn," Richard replied, a hint of pride warming his voice. "Gets that from his mother's line." They watched in comfortable silence as Thunder completed his therapy session. When Melissa finally led the horse back to his stall for rest, both men straightened from their leaning positions against the fence. "The university board approved the final purchase agreement yesterday," Jason said, turning to face Richard directly. "The lawyers are drawing up the paperwork now," Richard nodded, emotions tangled in his chest. The sale of the Western pasture to Montana State University would provide enough funds to clear the most pressing debts and negotiate new terms with the bank for the remaining property. It was the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Yet the reality of signing away land that had been in Sarah's family for generations still cut deep. "And it's a fair price," Richard acknowledged. "More than fair, actually. The department is excited about the research possibilities," Jason explained, his enthusiasm genuine. "The transition zone between ranchland and forest creates unique ecological opportunities. We're already planning wildlife corridors and restoration projects," Richard managed to smile, appreciating how the younger man's vision transformed what felt like failure into something positive, a continuation rather than an ending. "Sarah would have liked that," he said quietly. "Ah, she always said that land was meant to be more than just a commodity." Before Jason could respond, Melissa joined them, removing her work gloves and tucking them into her back pocket. A light sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead despite the cool autumn air, and Richard was struck anew by how much she resembled her mother, the same determined set to her jaw, the same capability in her hands. "Doctor Wilkins says Thunder's exceeding expectations," she reported. "He's cleared him for longer therapy sessions starting next week." "That's great news," Jason said, his expression softening as he looked at her. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and Richard felt a bittersweet pang watching this silent communication between them. "I'd better get back to the shelter," Richard said, glancing at his watch. "Cindy's expecting me for the afternoon shift. How's that going?" Melissa asked, genuine interest in her voice. These small inquiries about his community service had become more frequent lately, each one a tiny thread being rewoven into the fabric of their relationship. "Better than I expected," Richard admitted. We've got 3 new dogs coming in today, surrenders from a family that lost their home." What he didn't say, but what they all understood, was how his perspective had shifted during his weeks at the shelter. Working with animals who had been abandoned or mistreated had forced Richard to confront the reality of his actions with thunder in ways that mere guilt or legal punishment couldn't accomplish. "Dad, don't forget we're meeting with the bank tomorrow at 10, Melissa reminded him. "They want both our signatures on the restructuring agreement." "I'll be there," he promised. As Richard drove toward town, he reflected on how much had changed in the weeks since that desperate evening at the oak tree. The ranch was still struggling, but no longer drowning. Thunder was injured, but healing. And his relationship with Melissa, while not fully restored, had found a new foundation based on honesty rather than protection. The mandatory sessions with Dr. Eleanor Patel, the psychologist assigned to him through the Rancher Mental Health Program, had been particularly transformative. Initially resistant to the very concept of therapy, Richard had gradually come to value the weekly hour that forced him to articulate feelings he'd spent a lifetime suppressing. Ranchers are conditioned to equate vulnerability with weakness, Dr. Patel had observed during their most recent session. "But there's tremendous strength in acknowledging when you can't carry a burden alone." Those words echoed in Richard's mind as he pulled into the animal shelter parking lot. Cindy greeted him with a nod as he entered, her initial coolness having thawed into something approaching their old friendship. "3 surrenders just arrived," she informed him, handing over intake forms, 2 labs and a shepherd mix. "All housebroken, thankfully, but pretty shaken up." Richard reviewed the paperwork. "Family lost their farm." "Foreclosure," Cindy confirmed, the word carrying extra weight between them. "Bank gave them 30 days to vacate. They're moving to Billings to stay with relatives. Couldn't take the dogs." Richard felt the familiar twist of empathy, stronger now that he'd faced his own version of that same nightmare. "And they'll get them settled in." The 3 dogs watched him warily as he entered their temporary kennel, a black lab, a yellow lab, and a German shepherd mix, all adult dogs with good manners, but confusion in their eyes. They didn't understand why their world had suddenly changed, why the people they trusted had left them behind. "I know how you feel," Richard told them quietly as he set down water bowls. "Sometimes the world changes faster than we can adapt." He spent extra time with them, sitting on the concrete floor despite his aching knee, letting them adjust to his presence and learn that this strange new place held some measure of safety. By the end of his shift, the yellow lab had ventured close enough to rest his head briefly on Richard's lap. A small victory, but one that felt significant. As Richard prepared to leave, Cindy approached with an unusual request. The weekend volunteer who usually handles the off-site adoption event at Peterson's feed store can't make it this Saturday, she explained. "I know it's not your regular day, but I was hoping you might fill in." Richard hesitated. The shelter's adoption events were public affairs, with dozens of community members stopping by. It would mean facing many of his neighbors for the first time since his court appearance. "I'm not sure people would want to adopt from someone with my recent history," he said carefully. Cindy's expression softened with unexpected compassion. "Richard, everyone in this county has known you their entire lives. What you did was terrible, yes, but it doesn't erase 40 years of being a decent man. People have longer memories than that." Her words caught him off guard. After weeks of judgment and carefully neutral interactions, Cindy's simple affirmation of his fundamental character felt like a pardon he hadn't known he was seeking. "I'll do it," he found himself saying. The next morning, Richard met Melissa at Western Montana Bank, where they signed the restructuring agreement that would keep the core of the Miller Ranch intact. The loan officer, a young woman who had graduated high school with Melissa, handled the transaction with professional courtesy. "Congratulations," she said as they completed the paperwork. "Not many family operations survive these kinds of challenges." Walking out into the crisp autumn sunshine, Richard felt lighter than he had in months. The weight of secrecy and impending disaster had been replaced by the more manageable burden of rebuilding. "The university surveyors want to walk the property line next week," Melissa said, as they stood beside their trucks in the parking lot. Jason asked if we'd both join them, give some historical context about the land usage. Richard nodded. "I'd like that." A slightly awkward silence fell between them, until Melissa took a deep breath and broached the subject they'd both been carefully avoiding. "Dad, Jason has asked me to have dinner with him. Not just as friends or colleagues, an actual date." Richard looked at his daughter, confident, capable, and suddenly vulnerable in a way that reminded him painfully of the teenage girl who had once asked his advice about school dances and college applications. "He's a good man," Richard said simply. "Your mother would have approved." Melissa's eyes glistened slightly. "I think so too." She hesitated, then added, "Would you be okay stopping by to check on Thunder tomorrow evening, around 7? "Of course," Richard agreed, understanding the significance of being trusted again with Thunder's care, even for a brief visit. That Saturday, Richard found himself setting up the animal shelter's adoption booth outside Peterson's feed store, arranging crates and exercise pens for the 6 dogs and 4 cats they'd brought. Among them were the 3 surrenders from earlier in the week, now wearing adoption vests and ready to meet potential new families. Richard had barely finished setting up when Dale Jenkins appeared, examining the dogs with practiced interest. "Heard you might be here," the foreman said by way of greeting. "That shepherd mix looks like he has potential." "Good eye," Richard replied, surprised but pleased to see his longtime employee. "Oh, he's about 3, house-trained, good with livestock from what the previous owners said." Dale knelt to offer his hand to the dog, who sniffed it cautiously before allowing a tentative pet. "Ranch has been too quiet since we lost old Blue last winter. Might be time for a new dog." As the morning progressed, more familiar faces appeared. Neighbors, church members, parents of kids Melissa had gone to school with. Some interactions were awkward, with conversation carefully steered away from Thunder or the ranch's financial troubles, but others were surprisingly normal, focusing on the animals available for adoption or mundane community matters. By midday, 2 cats and 1 dog had found new homes, and Dale had completed the paperwork to adopt the shepherd mix, whom he decided to name Scout. "He'll need some time to adjust," Richard advised, as Dale loaded the dog's new supplies into his truck. "But he seems smart, eager to please." "Sounds like someone else I know," Dale replied with the ghost of a smile, the first Richard had seen from him since that terrible night. "People can adjust too, given time and the right circumstances." The simple observation, coming from a man of few words, carried the weight of absolution. Later that afternoon, as Richard was packing up the remaining animals for return to the shelter, Sheriff Donovan stopped by, out of uniform but unmistakable in his bearing. "Successful day?" the sheriff inquired, nodding toward the adoption board where 4 "adopted it" signs now hung. "Better than expected," Richard acknowledged. Sheriff Donovan nodded thoughtfully. "Judge Reynolds was asking about your progress yesterday. Told her you've been exemplary with the community service hours. She seemed pleased, but not surprised." "The judge has always been a good judge of character," Richard said, "even when that character temporarily fails to live up to her expectations." "Well," the sheriff replied with a hint of approval, "some men spend a lifetime running from their mistakes. Others use them as stepping stones. Seems to me you're doing the latter." As Richard finished loading the last crate into the shelter's van, he spotted Jason's blue pickup pulling into the feed store parking lot. Melissa sat in the passenger seat, and even from a distance, Richard could see her laughing at something Jason had said. The sight didn't sting, as he might have expected. Instead, he felt a quiet contentment, Life was continuing, evolving into something different, but not necessarily lesser than what had come before. That evening, as the sun set over the reduced but still viable Miller Ranch, Richard stood alone at Sarah's favorite spot, overlooking the eastern pasture. The autumn light gilded the landscape, softening the evidence of drought and hardship that had driven him to such desperate measures just weeks before. "I nearly lost it all," he said aloud, as if his wife could hear him. "But I'm finding my way back, Sarah, not to what was, but to something new, something honest." A cool breeze lifted the ends of his jacket, carrying the scent of distant snow from the mountains. Winter would come, with its own challenges and tests. But for the first time in years, Richard Miller faced the changing seasons without the crushing weight of facing them alone. Spring came to Clearwater County with gentle persistence, green shoots pushing through soil, still bearing the memory of winter frost. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening at the oak tree, half a year of small steps forward and occasional steps back, of rebuilding what had been broken and finding peace with what had been lost. Richard stood at the fence of the therapy paddock, watching as Melissa led Thunder in gentle circles. The horse moved with a pronounced but manageable limp, his surgically repaired leg bearing weight confidently now after months of careful rehabilitation. Though Thunder would never again carry a rider at full gallop, his quality of life had surpassed even Dr. Wilkins' most optimistic predictions. "He's looking strong today," Jason observed, joining Richard at the fence. The young biologist had become a fixture at the Miller Ranch, both professionally as he established the university's research station on the former western pasture, and personally as his relationship with Melissa deepened. "Best day yet," Richard agreed. "Dr. Wilkins says he might be ready for light riding by summer." The two men watched in companionable silence as Melissa completed Thunder's exercise routine. The morning sun illuminated the scene with golden clarity, catching in Melissa's hair and gleaming on Thunder's coat, freshly brushed to a high shine. So much had changed in 6 months. The Miller Ranch was smaller now, reduced by the sale of the western pasture, but financially stable for the first time in years. The university's research station was taking shape at the edge of the property, a collection of modest buildings and monitoring equipment that represented not just income, but a new purpose for land that had been in the family for generations. "The wildlife corridor proposal got approved yesterday," Jason said, breaking the silence. "Oh, the grant committee was impressed with the potential for connecting the Forest Service land through your property to the river basin." Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and wistfulness. "Sarah would have loved that. She always said we were just temporary caretakers of this land." "Melissa said the same thing," Jason replied with a small smile, though she added that temporary still means fighting to keep it in the family for another 100 years. Richard chuckled, recognizing his daughter's determination. "That sounds about right." As Melissa finished Thunder's session and led him back toward the barn, Richard checked his watch. "I should get going." Saturday morning shift at the shelter. What had begun as court-ordered community service had evolved into something approaching a calling. Richard had completed over half of his required hours, but recently he'd found himself volunteering for additional shifts, drawn to the straightforward gratification of helping animals in need. Cindy had promoted him to volunteer coordinator the previous month, putting him in charge of training new helpers and organizing the weekend adoption events. The role suited him, his organizational skills, honed by decades of ranch management, transferring seamlessly to this new context. "Don't forget dinner tonight," Jason reminded him. "Melissa's been planning all week." Richard nodded, a slight knot forming in his stomach despite his best efforts. Tonight was a milestone of sorts, the first time Melissa had invited her Uncle Robert to the ranch since Sarah's funeral. That she had included Richard in the invitation rather than scheduling separate visits represented significant progress in their healing relationship. "I'll bring dessert," Richard promised, "from Wilson's Bakery." The animal shelter was already bustling when Richard arrived. Spring always brought an influx of kittens and puppies, overwhelming the small facility's resources. Today, a litter of 7 mixed-breed puppies had been surrendered, their mother a stray who had given birth in someone's garden shed. "There you are," Cindy greeted him with evident relief. "We've got a full house today and 3 adoption applications to process." Richard hung up his jacket and donned the shelter vest that no longer felt like a badge of shame, but a uniform he wore with quiet pride. "Put me to work." The morning passed in a productive blur, walking dogs, socializing the new puppies, interviewing potential adopters with the careful attention that Cindy had taught him. Each animal that came through the shelter's doors carried its own story, its own needs, its own capacity for recovery despite past trauma or neglect. During a brief lunch break, Richard found himself sitting with Cindy in the small staff room, sharing a thermos of coffee. "Judge Reynolds stopped by yesterday," Cindy mentioned casually. "She was asking about your progress." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Good things, I hope." "Very good things," Cindy confirmed with a smile. "I told her you've been exceptional, not just putting in the hours, but really connecting with the work." Richard felt a flush of pride at the commendation. "It's been healing," he admitted, "working with these animals, seeing them recover, find new homes." "Some people never get it," Cindy observed. They serve their community service hours resentfully, counting down until they're done. But others," she looked at him thoughtfully, "others find something they didn't know they were looking for." Before Richard could respond, one of the younger volunteers poked her head into the break room. "Mr. Miller, that family is back, the ones interested in the shepherd puppy from last week. They have some more questions." As Richard excused himself to speak with the potential adopters, he reflected on Cindy's words. He had indeed found something unexpected in his mandated service, a purpose that existed outside the identity he'd built around the ranch, a way of contributing that didn't depend on success or failure as defined by bank balances and property lines. Later that afternoon, as Richard was preparing to leave, Dr. Wilkins arrived unexpectedly. "Thought I might find you here," the veterinarian said. "Got a moment?" Richard nodded, curious about the unscheduled visit. "Everything okay with Thunder?" "Thunder's doing fine," Dr. Wilkins assured him. "Actually, I'm here about something else. The county's rural veterinary program is expanding. We're looking for someone to coordinate emergency response for large animal incidents, injured livestock, rescues, that sort of thing." Richard frowned, not seeing the connection. "That's good news, but it's a part-time position," Dr. Wilkins continued, "paid with flexible hours. The right person would need experience with livestock, good organizational skills, and," he paused meaningfully, "a demonstrated commitment to animal welfare." The implication hung in the air between them. "You're offering me a job?" Richard asked incredulously. "After what I did?" Dr. Wilkins leaned against the wall, considering his response. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have considered it, but I've watched you these past months, Richard. With Thunder, with the shelter animals, people can change when they're truly committed to it." Richard was silent, processing the unexpected opportunity. "You don't have to answer now," the veterinarian added. "Think about it. Talk it over with Melissa." As Richard drove home to prepare for the evening's dinner, his mind swirled with possibilities he couldn't have imagined half a year earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. that his lowest moment, his worst decision, had somehow set in motion a chain of events leading to new paths he might never otherwise have discovered. The Miller ranch house glowed with warm light as evening settled over the valley. Melissa had spent the day preparing for this reunion dinner, cleaning and cooking with the focused energy Richard recognized from her mother. Now, as he helped set the dining room table, Sarah's good china and silver brought out for the occasion, he could smell pot roast and fresh bread, comfort foods that spoke of home and continuity. "Uncle Robert just texted," Melissa reported, checking her phone while arranging a bouquet of early spring flowers. "He's about 10 minutes out." Richard nodded, adjusting a fork with unnecessary precision. "And Jason? Already here, out back getting the fire pit ready for after dinner." She paused, studying her father's tense movements. "It's going to be okay, Dad. Robert's not coming to fight." "I know," Richard said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Robert Thornton had made his feelings abundantly clear at Sarah's funeral, blaming Richard for his sister working herself to exhaustion during her illness, for prioritizing the ranch over her health. The subsequent years of silence had only calcified those accusations. The sound of tires on gravel announced Robert's arrival. Melissa squeezed her father's arm reassuringly before going to greet her uncle. Richard remained in the dining room, listening to the murmur of voices in the entryway, Melissa's warm welcome, Robert's deeper tones, then Jason joining them from the back of the house. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever reception awaited him. When Robert entered the dining room, Richard was struck by how much older his brother-in-law looked. At 60, Robert's hair had gone completely grey, and grief had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. "Richard," he acknowledged with a stiff nod. "Robert," Richard returned, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." After a moment's hesitation, Robert accepted the handshake. Melissa can be persuasive. Just like her mother. The dinner began awkwardly, with conversation limited to safe topics, the weather, Robert's accounting practice in Billings, the excellent food Melissa had prepared. Gradually, as the meal progressed, the tension began to ease, helped along by Jason's natural ability to bridge difficult conversational gaps. It was during dessert, Sarah's favorite apple pie from Wilson's Bakery, that Robert finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Melissa tells me you nearly lost the ranch," he said directly to Richard. Richard set down his fork. "Yes, the drought hit us hard 3 years running. We managed to save most of it by selling the western section to the university." Robert nodded slowly. "And that business with your horse," Melissa explained what happened. A heavy silence fell over the table. Richard felt heat rising in his face, shame mingling with defensive anger. But before he could respond, Melissa spoke. "Dad made a terrible mistake," she said quietly but firmly. "He spent every day since then making amends, to Thunder, to me, to the community. He's not the same person who did that." Robert studied his niece's face, then looked to Richard with evaluating eyes. "Sarah always said you were a proud man, too proud to ask for help, even when you needed it." "She was right," Richard admitted. "When that pride nearly cost me everything that matters." Another silence descended, but this one felt different, contemplative rather than accusatory. "I should have reached out," Robert finally said. "After Sarah died, she wouldn't have wanted the silence between us." "No," Richard agreed softly, "she wouldn't have." After dinner, they moved to the fire pit Jason had prepared in the backyard. The night was clear and cool, stars emerging in the vast Montana sky as they settled into Adirondack chairs around the crackling flames. The conversation flowed more easily now. Memories of Sarah shared without the sharp edge of recrimination that had characterized their last encounter. When Robert eventually stood to leave, promising to visit again soon, Richard walked him to his car. "I never told you," Robert said as they reached the vehicle, "but Sarah called me near the end. She made me promise to look out for you and Melissa." He shook his head ruefully. "I didn't do a very good job of keeping that promise." "We all fail the people we love sometimes," Richard replied, thinking of thunder tied to the oak tree, of the secrets he'd kept from Melissa, of all the ways pride and fear had driven his worst decisions. "And the question is what we do afterward." Robert considered this, then nodded. "I'd like to try again if you're willing." "I am," Richard said simply. After Robert departed, Richard found himself drawn to the old oak tree that marked the boundary of what was now university land. In the spring moonlight, the ancient tree was beginning to leaf out, new growth emerging from branches that had weathered countless seasons of change. The sound of hoofbeats made him turn. Melissa was leading Thunder toward him, the horse moving carefully but confidently across the soft spring grass. Jason followed a few paces behind, a respectful distance that allowed the family moment to unfold naturally. "Dr. Wilkins said a short walk in the evening would be good for him," Melissa explained as she reached her father. "Well, I thought he might like to visit the old oak." Richard swallowed past the sudden tightness in his throat. "Full circle," he managed. "In a way," Melissa agreed. She handed Thunder's lead rope to her father. "He's still your horse too, Dad. He always has been." Richard took the rope with trembling fingers. Thunder regarded him steadily, those intelligent eyes reflecting the moonlight. Then with deliberate gentleness, the horse lowered his head and bumped it against Richard's chest, a gesture of such simple forgiveness that Richard felt tears spring to his eyes. "Hey, old friend," he whispered, stroking the white blaze between Thunder's eyes. "Look how far we've come." As they stood together beneath the oak tree, man, horse, daughter, and the young man who represented the future, Richard felt the complex tapestry of loss and renewal that had defined the past 6 months. The ranch was smaller but sustainable. His relationship with Melissa was different but honest in ways it hadn't been before. And he himself had been humbled, then slowly rebuilt into someone who better resembled the man Sarah had loved, the father Melissa needed, the person he aspired to be. One terrible decision on a desperate evening had nearly cost him everything. But standing here now, with Thunder's solid warmth beneath his hand and the spring breeze carrying promises of new growth, Richard Miller understood that sometimes the longest journey could lead right back home, not to the place you started, but to the person you were always meant to become.